Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Lorgar's discovery, Lorgar's Betrayal in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Index Asteroutes, Grey Knights. The Great Betrayal. At the dawn of Lorgar's Great Betrayal, the traitors to mankind purged their legions of those who would not join them. The main part of these purges took place in the Istvan system, in the conflict that became the first flashpoint of civil war. It was there, in the fire of fratricide, that the specks that would coagulate into the 22nd Legion first formed. As 8 legions converged on a star system of little note, many within them realized something outside the ordinary was beginning. Even as carefully chosen, small detachments from each legion were dispatched planet-side, however, no one suspected a rebellion. It was too absurd, too outside the paradigm of the Great Crusade. Captain Alexis Pollux of the Imperial Fists postulated that, perhaps, the Primarches were conducting a purge of some conspiracy, likely linked to the mysterious Alpha Legion. The truth percolated through the fleet slowly, but irrevocably, spread by rumor on purpose to weed out any further disloyalty, but that plan ran into the fact that Space Marines were, as it turned out, perfectly capable of keeping their allegiance concealed. And those Asteroutes that were not too much in shock to react began planning a counterstrike. When the order to bomb Istvan's surface was first given, Pollux and his counterpart Macer Varen of the World Eaters sent out a counter-order, inviting all those still loyal to the Emperor to join with them in an act of defiance. And many did, even among those that the traitor Primarches had been certain would meekly follow their treachery. The counter-rebellion was almost stillborn even with Pollux's and Varen's organizational masterstrokes, but somehow a great number of warriors with doubts chose to stand up and fight despite, for the first time in their lives, having no plausible chance at victory, and a battle began where there was meant to be only slaughter. Simultaneously, Luthor of the Dark Angels, a man ill at ease with the Lion's chaos sorcery, arrived in system. Luthor had deduced Lorgar's plans and had foreseen resistance. He had come, with many of his Dark Angels, to assist that counter-rebellion. Leaders emerged from each of the traitor legions during this time. Alexis Pollux of the Imperial Fists and Macer Varen of the World Eaters were joined by Nomus Rhy of the Salamanders and Luthor of the Dark Angels, Ulrich Brandthen of the Iron Hands and Shivan Khan of the White Scars, Barrow-Suz of the Iron Warriors and Sor Talgrone of the Word Bearers themselves. Moreover, the traitors, far from coming together, began to splinter in the face of conflict. Yet Lorgar still had an overwhelming numerical advantage, and over the course of a week he began at last to bring it to bear. At first he set his house in order, brokering peace between the World Eaters and White Scars, as well as between the Iron Hands and Iron Warriors. Meanwhile, Argiltal of the Word Bearers bombed the Loyalists on the surface. Brandthen died in this bombardment, while frantically organizing a partially successful evacuation. Shivan Khan, meanwhile, was killed by his own Primarch. Facing destruction, the Loyalists executed a desperate retreat plan worked out by Barrow-Suz and Brandthen's successor Cadmus Tyro. The two warriors of rival legions worked together in stark contrast to their fathers' warfare, and managed to get about 14,000 survivors out of Istvan. Most of these voyaged to the solar system, although Luthor instead retreated to his home planet of Caliban. They bore the dark news in various ways, the 8 leaders of the retreating fleet. Pollux searched desperately for a logical explanation, coming to the conclusion that the power of chaos seduced Lorgar and the others by playing on their emotions. Varen saw instead the influence of xeno-conspiracies and gene-seed corruption that left little to choice. Sarkandur, leader of the Dark Angel contingent after Luthor's departure, reacted with hate where Rhy instead felt grief, and Tyro used his mechanical components to approach a state of cold logic. Torgun Khan, Shivan Khan's successor, was of the opinion that it was a simple rebellion of leaders ambitious for power. Talgrone perceived the traitors as obsessing over the past, and responded by obsessing over the future. Barrow-Suz's viewpoint was comparable, but he viewed Lorgar's rebellion as rejecting past as well as future, and losing sight of time entirely. Perturabo, all of them, they have lost context. They have found a faith, and embraced it while ignoring every reason for faith. They have walked a road that leads only to oblivion, and have forgotten why they took their first steps on it, forgotten the basic ideals in favor of lies they would not have seen 2 steps earlier. They are a warning of what happens when we lose touch with the ground. They will lose the war, though, they do not have the strength to win it. They will lose the war, as they have lost themselves. Betrayal. The traitor legions moved to Terra relatively slowly, partly due to the influence of Alpharius's spies, but mostly because of a desire to illuminate planets they could have simply flown by, and large fleets always moved more slowly than small ones. Nonetheless, the Istvan survivors would not have reached Terra before the first fleet via normal methods, and were only able to do so due to some extremely dangerous navigating, one that left a number of their ships lifeless wrecks, a desperation the other loyal legions did not share, because they had not felt their Father's blades at their back. The survivors were ready to aid in any way they could, though news of the rebellion had already reached the throne world, but they were met with some distrust from Terra's defenders, especially the Raven Guard and the Custodes. But not from the Emperor. The Emperor of mankind looked on them and saw Astaroths who had somehow survived when they'd had no conceivable method of doing so, and dealt his enemies a significant blow in doing so. He saw, too, loyalists who had denied the taint of chaos despite not knowing of it. And he saw, despite all this, a disorganized fleet of refugees devastated by losing their fathers, and their purpose. So he gave them a new one. Under the supervision of Malkador the Sigillite, the 10,000 Astaroths were split into two halves. Varen, Andur, Tyro, and Talgrone, along with their Gene brothers, were to become the nucleus of the 21st Legion. Betrayal, Rhytan, Pollux, and Torgun with the refugees of their legions, meanwhile, were designated as the initial commanders of the 22nd. And on Titan, a moon of Saturn desolate since the start of the Age of Strife, the two groups began a ritual to transform their gene seeds into an uplifted form. It did not go as planned. It is believed that this was due to the special attentions of the Chaos Gods, which limited any constructive use of the warp's power. The Astaroths designated as the 21st, suffered worse from this due to the mutilation Angren imposed on the World Eater's gene seed, and died to a man. But the attentions of Chaos were divided, and so most of the Space Marines and associated initiates of the 22nd survived, though their transformation left them unable to participate in the war for Terra due to the time dilation the ritual involved. As they rose from their hibernation, and heard of the Emperor's fate, the former Imperial Fists, Iron Warriors, White Scars, and Salamanders recognized that they had become more than they had been. Their gene seed had transformed and fused, making them an entirely new strain of Space Marine. And as a primary consequence, their consciousnesses were now connected in a loose hive mind, which also granted distributed psychic powers, far weaker, individually, than those of the Thousand Suns, but capable of exponentially greater feats the more of them were gathered in one place. And while the Thousand Suns' powers were of the abyss which only the bravest dared test, and most legions Libraria were of the, so to speak, pelagic vastness of the great ocean, the abilities of the awakening Astaroths were of its rippling rainbow surface, the infinite interface between reality and possibility. The Grey Knights had been born. The escape. The newborn legion's first taskings were given by Malkador, in the disorderly aftermath of the betrayal. The Imperium's civil war was ongoing, and despite the fact that Lorgar and his allied legions were retreating into the impenetrable warp storm known as the Eye of Terror, they were far from crushed. The Grey Knights were divided into 4 brotherhoods, one for each of their grandmasters, Pollux's Crimson, Torgun's Platinum, Rhytan's Vacuum, and Berossus's Emerald. These were not drawn along the lines of the old legions at all, each legion fragment was evenly divided among the brotherhoods. However, despite the beginnings of a vigorous Imperium-wide recruitment program, the 22nd Legion was far under strength. Thus, the Vacuum and Platinum Brotherhoods joined up with the Thousand Suns Legion, while the Emerald Brotherhood oversaw recruitment and the Crimson Brotherhood was associated with various Imperial army forces. The greatest war the Grey Knights participated in, during this period, took place on the death world of Canuck. There, the seemingly random wanderings of the traitor Primarch Fukin, and with him the main part of the Salamander's Legion, were intercepted by Magnus and the Grey Knights. The massive, rotting form of Fukin was unstoppable in hand-to-hand combat, and killed Rhytan early on in the battle. But mere hours later, a psychic attack by Magnus threw Fukin to his death inside an active volcano, and the Salamander's defense turned from confident to desperate. Nevertheless, they held on in their strongholds, bolstered by the timeless powers of their patron Nurgle. The psychic siege lasted several Terran years, and Torgun Khan even proposed simply declaring exterminatus, but in the end, the Suns and the Knights cleansed the planet by less destructive means. The 18th Legion was broken yet again, after Nocturne and Terra, and has never entirely recovered its organization. The Vacuum Brotherhood chose a new leader, and the Grey Knights continued to serve, mostly in large groupings, across the recuperating Imperium. Of the 10 Loyalist legions during this time, they were noted as being the most dedicated warriors for their number, seeking to redeem every trace of their original Father's taint. The 4 brotherhoods function largely as 4 cohesive and independent units, separate from other legions' forces, in the latter part of the war to reclaim the galaxy. As the Imperium of Man stabilized, Malkador ordered the remaining Loyalist legions to choose callings other than war. The Grey Knights' Psychic Council chose the entwined directions of education and communication, uplifting the Imperium's worlds and uniting them, doing above the surface of public knowledge what the Alpha Legion did below it. Many Grey Knight groups serve as, in effect, mobile astropath teams, the most powerful in the Imperium. By the time Malkador died, the Grey Knights were widely considered his legion, particularly by some of the scheming High Lords. In reality, however, the Grey Knights were loyal above all to the Emperor, no matter his unconscious state. It had been the Emperor that had reforged them and given them a greater purpose, in those days of the betrayal. Increasingly, over those decades, the Grey Knights began putting great emphasis on honoring and even worshipping the Emperor. They even came close to abandoning the imperial truth altogether, but Barrow-Suse of the Emerald Brotherhood fought through the storm of the Legion's hive mind and delivered an oration that reaffirmed that the Emperor was the greatest of men, not a god, though, in many ways, being the former put him above the latter. The claims of divinity were not heresy, and I will repeat so until my last day, even if many among the Legion will disagree with me. It is not impossible, for a god to be worth worshipping. It is not evil, for myths to be true. But, as Barrow-Suse so rightly demonstrated, in the case of our world they are false. Alexis Pollux. The Long War. The Grey Knights have continued to serve, throughout the Imperium and on the front lines, for the 10 millennia since their founding. In early M34, for example, the Grey Knights purged the Hollow Cult, a chaos organization that had spread through much of Segmentum Obscurus, the Alpha Legion failing to contain it. The entire Grey Knights Legion, led for the campaign by a warrior named Khalistan believed to be the reincarnation of Alexis Pollux and by the eternal dreadnought Torgun Khan, waged a 3-year war against the cult, ultimately reducing them to a single but extremely well-defended star system. There, 110,000 Grey Knights gathered, and crafted a psychic avatar, a force of nature more powerful than even a Primarch. The avatar annihilated the Hollow Cult, killing every daemon and chaos-tainted human on the worlds, but it threatened to become uncontrollable. Ultimately, Khalistan, bolstered by the rest of the Legion, challenged the avatar to a psychic duel. Khalistan lost his life, but bought time for Torgun Khan to spread the Grey Knights so thinly the avatar faded from existence. In the 9th century of M34, the Grey Knights fought and triumphed against the Flawless Host, a subfaction of the despoilers of the XXI Legion's legacy, the Red Corsairs. The host had spread itself too thin, and the Grey Knights fell like a hammer onto each of their worlds in turn, blocking their communication such that it took the host 12 years to realize they were being invaded. Still, the victory did not erase the blank spot on the galactic map. Many of the worlds conquered by the host were, unfortunately, too far gone for any solution but exterminatus. But the Grey Knights in no way limit themselves to fighting the forces of chaos, though their psychic ability and nigh incorruptibility does encourage such confrontations. In 540.M36, for instance, they stood against a massive Orc Wa'aic. On Stenaris 4. The Stenari Combine had asked for help, promising total submission to the Imperium if they were saved from the green threat. By a stroke of luck, the entire Crimson Brotherhood was in the general vicinity. They met the Orcs, a battle fought in the psychic realm as much as in the physical. They splintered the very power of the Wa'aic, and the Green Scourge turned against itself, Orc killing Orc, in a frenzy that only ended when every spore on the planet had been wasted. The Guild Masters of Stenaris 4 were highly impressed, and the Grey Knights' integration of the world met no difficulties. Not every war the Grey Knights have fought has ended in success, of course. In 601.M41, a large detachment of the Platinum Brotherhood under Ram's Torn Fane clashed with Necrons on the world of Critter without fully appreciating the Xenos' previously unseen anti-psychic technology, ending with the annihilation of 3/4 of the Grey Knight's local strength and the retreat of the remnants, leaving Fane and his 7 most probable successors all dead. But the Grey Knights have recovered from this disaster, as from any other defeat. They continue to fight, as one, for the Emperor on countless worlds. And though their selves may be fluid, their mission has never been. They bring the Imperium together, with words and with force weaponry, in the name of the Emperor and for the glory of mankind. Organization. The Grey Knights number approximately 110,000, as that number maximizes the total strength of their psychic network. They are divided into 4 equal-sized brotherhoods, each nominally at 30,000 soldiers, and practically at somewhat less, and led by a Grand Master. The brotherhoods are each divided into 15 orders led by paladins, each of which is divided into 20 companies led by captains. A company is nominally 100 Grey Knights. It is rare that a company is broken up between missions, as the Grey Knights are far more powerful in groups. It is far more typical that a company's fleet will fly through the Imperium, making long stays on individual worlds. The ships that make up a company's fleet are known as black ships, due to their color, white ships being those tied to Titan itself. Companies recruit on their own, but are generally guided by their superior officers. Each company does contain 7 squads of 12, plus 16 asteroids in a command squad, but even in individual wars this organization is fluid, as the Grey Knight's hive mind allows. Geronidon was gone. So many others, too. The Salamander's price had been simple: the sergeant of each among the 4th Vacuum Order's squads, lost to the trap. Their goal, too, Drago now understood. It was a ritual to return their Primarch to them despite his death on Canuck. He could see the Daemon Prince, and wondered how any could oppose him. A magnificent, humanoid figure, with the head of a dragon and eyes of blue fire. Eyes of blue fire. Not red. Drago felt the memory through the hive mind. Eyes of blue fire. This was not Fukin. Drago roared, shaking himself out of the stupor, ordering his command squad to disperse among the others, ordering a rapid reorganization of the Order's assets, ordering an immediate charge. He may not have had an official rank, but they were Grey Knights, under the proper conditions that hardly mattered. There was no Primarch here, no unbreakable wall for the traitors. And the loss of the Knights' nominal leaders, the Salamanders would soon find out, had done nothing to protect the Chaos Asteroids either. Specialists among the 22nd Legion are generally of 3 types, known as Purifiers, Purgators, and Apothecaries. All Grey Knights gain some measure of psychic talent from their gene seed. Some, however, also have natural talent that is enhanced rather than, as in most cases, suppressed during their ascension. These, making up only slightly less than 1% of the Legion, become Purifiers. They are responsible for serving as nexuses of the Grey Knight's psychic network and keeping it clean from weaknesses and taint. They are temporarily attached to companies, but ultimately fall under the command of their order. Purgators are the Tech Marine equivalents for the 22nd Legion. They take, as is normal, a lengthy training course on Mars, but they also spend time on Terra itself, learning more lore than others of the chapter on their enemies. They are trained to both maintain and build the Legion's weaponry, but also to become experienced warriors against a specific kind of foe, perhaps a Xenos species of a category of Chaos Warrior. Apothecaries are broadly similar to other Legion's apothecaries, though they tend to fulfill more of a combat role, because of their knowledge being mostly recoverable. The Purgators and Apothecaries make up slightly under 3% of the Legion, each. They fall under the authority of specific companies, and will most commonly consist of a single Grey Knight in the company's command squad, training one successor. The Apothecaries and Purgators also have their own internal organization, unlike the Purifiers. In general, the Grey Knight's organization has been noted as surprisingly loose, and promotion is surprisingly easy. This is because the psychic network tends to enhance new recruits' skills faster than training alone. Combat Doctrine. The Grey Knights are characteristic for, unlike most Astarte forces, deploying almost exclusively in large groups due to their psychic powers demands, as full companies and often even as full orders. That said, the Grey Knights generally treat those psychic powers in a different fashion to the Thousand Sons or even other legions' librarians. They are used as a trump card, especially against enemies related to chaos, rather than as an integral part of fighting styles. More often, Grey Knights rely on their biological strengths, with a preference for melee combat. Surprisingly, given their hive mind, they often fight individually, covering each other's backs in indirect fashion. The Grey Knights rarely use heavy weaponry except when it is part of vehicles, of which the XXII Legion has a particularly large and varied detachment, especially with regard to skimmer-type fast attack craft. Most of their warriors bear both a bolter and a melee weapon, traditionally a sword, spear, or hammer of some sort. They are also distinguished by wearing, in battle, a characteristic angular helmet shape, one that improves their instincts and their hive-mind connection. When attacking a world, the Grey Knights will often use a grandiose psychic attack to begin, for reconnaissance and or intimidation. While the enemy is reeling from its direct effects, the Grey Knights will attack in crucial positions and establish beachheads, making an effort to target enemy leadership and win rapidly. Despite being closely tied to civilian imperial society, the XXII works together with mortal troops only distantly, serving as astropaths but rarely performing the duty of inspiration. In many cases, a world's conquest has been achieved by Grey Knights without human intervention, though the Imperial army has always been needed to hold the planet in question. While defending a world, Grey Knights are known for brinksmanship. The enemy will typically land without much difficulty, and seem to pose a significant threat to the Imperial defense, before the tide is turned, again signaled by a psychic opening gambit, which will rarely be the only such play. They will, however, work with the defenders in a far more direct fashion, whether those defenders are custodes, which the 22nd, alone of the Astarte legions, has a good relationship with, or mere PDF. Conjoined with this is, perhaps, a desire for symbolism, for even in genuinely hopeless situations the Grey Knights will fight, and often inspire their allies to fight, with not only continued resilience but continued innovation, to make sure their enemies remember their defiance. Asteroutes of any Imperial Legion will make last stands, but the Grey Knights alone approach them no differently than any other war. It has been claimed that the Grey Knight's hive mind has a drawback, in that it suppresses true genius, strategic in particular. It does, however, undoubtedly assure competence. Home world. Despite recruiting from throughout the Imperium, the Grey Knights make their home on the ice methane world Titan. During the Great Betrayal, Titan was a satellite of the Sol system's Saturn. In M33, during one of the rituals of the Grey Knights, Titan vanished and reappeared in the Annex system, orbiting binary red dwarfs. None in the Legion has volunteered an explanation for what happened and whether it was intentional. Titan's surface has been kept cryogenic, with architecture built of ice and solidified hydrocarbons. By the shores of the northern seas, the XXII keeps a web-like fortress monastery, with its spiritual center, the Halls of the Emperor, being a floating one-story town where none save the Asteroutes can pass. Much of the fortress monastery's remainder, however, is taken up by the University of Titan, various Legion news organizations, and other institutions open to the public. Further south is a belt of human settlements and animal life, and past that the equatorial desert, marked by ruins and monuments. The southern hemisphere is uninhabited, being a monument to the XXI which should have been. Titan is populated by only perhaps 1 million people altogether, most of those ultimately owing their jobs to Legion-related business. The rest stem from archaeology and chemical work with Titan's hydrocarbon resources, though they have long since ceased to be abundant enough to mine. Beliefs. The Grey Knights are seen in the Imperium as many things: inspiring teachers or scheming manipulators, psychic guardians, or psychic demagogues, unified warriors or fanatical berserkers. But the Legion itself, through its one mind, focuses on its role as a guardian of humanity's boundary, preferring not to clarify its stances on its myriad contradictions and let humans and legionnaires find their own way. Nevertheless, when that way leads to corruption, they do not hesitate to abruptly and dramatically interfere. Though the Grey Knights interact with the greater masses of mankind more than most legions, they remain liminal beings, ever existing between great and terrible oceans and finding rippling beauty, and impossible individuality, in the gaps. What is clear is that the Grey Knights believe in the traditional imperial truth, of logic, and optimism and human supremacy, more than any other legion, but then, it is their teachings that tend to define it. They especially believe in the importance of raising the greater masses of humanity to a higher level of development, as well as in their role as guardians against the warp. It has been noted that while the Grey Knights' loyalty to the Emperor is absolute, their respect for the Primarchs is somewhat muted. This, one would imagine, is due to the memory, echoing through their hive mind, of how their own Primarchs betrayed the Imperium and humanity, 10 millennia ago. Gene Seed. The Grey Knight's gene seed is utterly bizarre, as befits its origin. It nonetheless leads to physical effects fairly close to that of typical Astaroths, though on average Grey Knights are substantially stronger and slightly less nimble than that. But there is a strong psychic effect. Grey Knights are linked into a loose hive mind, creating a state that Legionnaires have consistently failed to properly describe to anyone else. Some suspect that this hive mind conserves scraps of Grey Knight's consciousness to persist even after their death, though it is unclear whether the available space for those memories is increasing or constant in time. Grey Knights also gain superficial psychic powers, made stronger in the presence of multiple Grey Knights. Thus, where 1,000 sun with fire-related powers might light a building on fire by invoking the plascrete's temperature, and a librarian might force oxidizing reactions to happen in the building's air, a Grey Knight might use a distant bushfire and skim a trail of flame across the warp interface to the target. Battle Cry. We are the Emperor's Spear. 999.M41. Anvilthon stood atop the cliff, dirty ice crunching beneath his ceramite boots. A kilometer below, the dark methane of Vid River flowed, cascading along a chaotic jumble of water ice, hydrocarbon sediment, and metal from ruins of past millennia towards the distant halls of the Emperor. Duty called, and Thon had less than an hour before he would need to start the seminar on Vulcany's altar. He would have preferred to be among those of his brethren fighting there, in truth. Yet he knew that the temptation to remove himself from humanity was one he could not allow himself to follow, no more so than any other temptation. And he had been reborn on Titan rather than at the site of his fall for a reason, even if he did not know what that reason was. Yet for now he stood here, halfway down the Vid's canyon walls, watching the flow. Staring into the dark current. Staring into a glint, one that seemed to blink in and out of existence. He could barely see it, but taking off his helmet, he noted a ring of blinking lights that must have been hundreds of meters down. Blinking, brilliantly, 10 elliptical lights arranged in a circle, a pattern he knew was dangerous but that. Anvilthon did not know how long it took his brothers to pull his mind back from the brink of the array of consciousnesses far vaster than his own. The first thing he remembered was, rather, sitting back, snapping his helm back into place in a panic. The only good news was that the Legion did not need to be warned, because it already knew. The embryos within Titan were awakening. Half within the warp, and half within reality, the Tomorrow Hegemons, as the men who had first led to their gestation had called them, 20 millennia ago as humanity ascended towards its first galactic zenith, were starting to do more than observe the planetary system with their compound eyes of doped germanium and strange matter and conceptual beauty and ancient truth. The beings that had once been used to write the STCs were beginning, as the Legion had always known they would eventually, to act. This was the reason why Titan had been abandoned 10 millennia ago, why the Grey Knights had pulled it out of the Sol system, but the shockwaves of the coming awakening would reach Terra nonetheless. And whether that would be for good or ill, Thon, and the Legion, had no idea. Check the description for the links to the author.